Joining me now on the set is our Environment Editor, Valérie Dekimpe. Hello to you, Valérie.
Hi, Will.
What we're seeing right now is this sort of growing rift between the North and the global South, and there's this risk that it could derail climate action.
There is a risk, yeah. I mean, it is fair to say that the last 2 years have been very disruptive for climate action and for climate diplomacy. The pandemic certainly eroded the sense of global solidarity, and you could already feel that tension at last year's UN Climate Summit in Glasgow, COP26. And now you could argue that the war in Ukraine could be the last straw to break the camel's back, and especially ahead of COP27. And the mood at this week's General Assembly, I think, is an indication of that, because a lot of people have been arguing, well, the war in Ukraine has overshadowed climate change, climate concerns. Well, they were not completely absent from the General Assembly, but it also depends on who was taking the podium in New York. And I did a little experiment, not necessarily very scientific, but it already gives you an idea. The leaders that put climate change at the heart of their speeches, well, it's Madagascar, Senegal, island nations like the Marshall Islands, the Philippines, Colombia, Kenya. All of those are developing nations who...
Frontline countries.
And contributing the least to climate change, but suffering the most from the consequences of that. Gabriel Boric, the president of Chile, for example, saying Chile is responsible for 0.2% of global greenhouse gas emissions. G20 nations, on the other hand, they produce 80% of greenhouse gas emissions. And then you see, at the General Assembly, U.S. President Joe Biden, French President Emmanuel Macron, skipping a climate roundtable hosted by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres and the Egyptian President El-Sisi ahead of COP27. And emerging from that meeting, you had Guterres saying that the goal of keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius was failing fast. So you do certainly see kind of alternative parallel narratives building, and there is a feeling among developing nations and the public as well that climate change has been put on the back burner, even though that it is a massive concern for the public.
Yeah, and for that reason, we're seeing these student protests continue around the world. This year, they're rallying around the cause of climate reparations for poor nations. Have countries made any progress on that?
Well, the rise in climate-related disasters has intensified calls for rich countries to help, bring financial reparations. And in UN jargon, they call that loss and damages, but it's really just a fancy word of saying, financial reparations to help countries recover from, natural disasters they cannot recover from and that they did not help cause in the first place. It is a highly contentious issue. The U.S. and Europe have long resisted the idea of setting up a funding mechanism, fearing that it would set a precedent and that so many countries would come forward with requests. It's always been a contentious issue. It will be at COP27 as well. Last year, countries actually failed to land a deal on this loss and damages problem. But now you see that developing nations are stepping up the pressure. We are expecting, for example, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, who is expected to address nations at the General Assembly in a way kind of presenting them with the bill of the devastating floods that hit the country this year. So observers really say that developing countries are kind of mounting an offensive and stepping up the pressure ahead of COP27. And that especially because the timing of, current events makes it really difficult to ignore what these countries say is an injustice. With the energy crisis, we see that fossil fuel companies are racking up massive profits. And that is why Guterres, for example, at the General Assembly called on countries to set up a windfall taxes on fossil fuel companies and for that money to be allocated specifically for losses and damages. And this is something that's not been mentioned before, at least within, the context of climate diplomacy. So that is something to, keep an eye on. A bit of positive news, though. Denmark on the margins of the General Assembly, became the first country to offer loss and damage compensation to vulnerable countries, a total of $13 million. It is just pennies compared to what countries actually need, of course, moving forward. It is estimated that the cost of kind of loss and damages could reach up to $3 trillion by 2050. So it is just pennies, but it is symbolic, and it also is a milestone that could potentially put pressure on other countries as well.
All right, Valerie, thank you very much. Valerie Dekimpe, France 24's Environment Editor.